Come on, Colts Nation. We are here. As I release this episode, we are just about 48 hours away from the Indianapolis Colts draft. We'll be sitting there. We'll be doing whatever it is that you do during the draft. One thing I will not be doing is streaming. I toyed with the idea. I found out Pat McAfee was going to have Bill Belichick onto his show. And quite frankly, I wouldn't watch me over that. That's what I'll be watching if I watch anything but the draft itself. But we're right here. I could not be any more excited. And as we go into this conversation today, just a quick question for you before we get started, just so I know moving forward. When we talk about the draft, not just right now, but I mean going forward even into like next season, what is the conversation that we're supposed to be having about the NFL draft? Like, what do you find more interesting? What the Colts should do, like in my opinion, or what the Colts will do, like a prediction, like actually giving what I think it is that they will do. Now, maybe it's a little bit of both, right? Because for me personally, I feel like coming into the draft, we almost have a conversation about what they will do, but we base that on what we feel like they should do. So make no mistake, the topic today will be about what the Colts will do in this draft. And I apologize, my nose right now is acting up like something you would not believe. This schnoz allergy season running thick over here in New York right now. Neither here nor there. I just want to warn you about that as we get into this episode. It might be a lengthy one, right? But again, today, all about what the Colts will do. Separate from my opinion on what I feel they should do, this right here is all about being accurate, right? Like, I feel particularly qualified, by the way, to be the one that brings this prediction to you because, quite frankly, it's a matter of trying to figure out what Chris Ballard has going on in that brain of his. And many of you that watch my show, along with other shows in Colts media, know damn well that there is no other talking head for the Indianapolis Colts that is as aligned with Chris Ballard as yours truly right here. We happen to think about things very similar very often. So I feel like I have this one, right? Like, I feel like I have it. And again, as I said, this episode is purely prediction-based and not based on my individual opinions of the players and what I want them to do. The goal is accuracy, not personal preference. Do I need to say it another way? I just feel like I'm repeating myself at this point. I'm just super excited about this episode because this is where I get to prove to some of you newer folks that weren't here last offseason just how right I can be about the Indianapolis Colts. Like, this right here is why they call your boy Coltstradamus. And that's not self-proclaimed, okay? Everyone calls me Coltstradamus. You call me Coltstradamus. I can tell you things about the Indianapolis Colts that other people simply cannot. And that's without any sources, without any inside scoop, just this brain right here. This brain, by the way, that is completely incapable of solving as simple as a 7th grade math equation. This brain that cannot use a ratchet or fluently hammer a nail into a wall, but this brain that has never been wrong about the Indianapolis Colts in its entire life. I didn't choose this, by the way, okay? It chose me. It's I don't know, like a God-given talent. Excuse me if I'm bragging a little bit, but I'm just right about this team so damn often. It's why I come to you guys with the show. I feel like I have no other choice. What am I supposed to do? Just keep it to myself? I got to give you guys some of the scoop too, so I'm not just sitting here as the smartest guy in the room when it comes to the team. All right, I apologize. I'm being a little bit self-indulgent right now. But again, a couple of disclaimers, just by the way, before we get into this one, because we're about to. This is not going to be me giving you like exact picks and players, like exact player at exact pick, rather, mind you, like player X at pick 15. That would be impossible to predict, number one, and also just not very useful, right? This video instead is going to be giving you a bunch of the possible scenarios and conditions that would lead to draft pick X, Y, or Z. I will have this narrowed down to a pool of players so that by the end of this video, you'll have a concentrated list of players that may be Colts come next week, and you'll be able to refer back to this video before and during the draft to kind of figure out what it is that you're looking at. My promise to you is that by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how the draft is going to go, or at least you'll know the number of ways it can go for the Indianapolis Colts. And while there are quite a few ways, there's quite a few ways it won't go as well. This episode will give you the truth you're going to know before April 25th at 8 p.m. or 8:30 p.m. whenever it gets to the Colts pick, right? But before we do all that, before I give you the goods, you know what it is. I got to introduce myself. My name is Justin. This right here is the Ride on the Bench Colts podcast. As always, guys, anyone enjoying the show, go ahead, shoot it a like. Going to help me get out to as many Colts fans as humanly possible. That's, of course, on YouTube if you're listening to the audio version. 5-star review. Let the people know how much you enjoy what it is that I'm putting out on a week-to-week basis over here. Subscribe if you've come back and not done that yet. You keep enjoying the content. You keep listening. Maybe today's the day. We're hoping to get to 3,000 by next season or I guess this upcoming season for the channel. We're not even close. We're shooting for 2,400 first. But most importantly, enjoy the show and commit these words to memory because you are about to watch some kid from Long Island, New York, 800 miles away from the city of Indianapolis, tell you exactly what it is that the Colts are going to do before the draft ever happens. I am like, if you can't tell, I'm juiced up right now. Like, I cannot be any more excited about this episode, about the draft. It's the start of the new season, starts today, or I guess really at the draft. You get my point, man. I am hyped. But let's start this episode right here, right now. Of course, timestamps all the way through. You can skip to wherever it is that you want to be. So obviously, as it pertains to the first round, it in some way determines the direction of the rest of the draft, right? When you talk about the first round, and realistically, there's quite a few possibilities there as well. Now, one thing I'm starting to become quite confident in as we get closer to this draft is that the Colts will not be walking out of the NFL draft with Quinyon Mitchell or Terrion Arnold, at least as far as getting them at the 15th overall pick. Not to say they won't be Colts. They will not be drafting any of those players or either of those players at number 15 overall, and I will explain to you why. So, for starters, the way Chris Ballard spoke about our corners in his pre-draft press conference, really, he kept making the parallel to the offensive line going into last season. Anyone that was here listening to me knows that I felt, much like Chris Ballard, that was much of an overblown issue. I said, of all the things I'm worried about going into this season, this past season that is, it was the offensive line. I knew they were going to be quite all right. So I agreed with him on that front, and as he said that, sure enough, he went into that draft and did not do much of anything prior to the draft to address the offensive line, and ended up just drafting Blake Freeland, which ended up working out pretty damn well. So much like that situation, I think he views this corner group as a group that is better than many people think it is. And I can't say I technically disagree with that, although probably not to the same degree, in all fairness, that I did the offensive line. Like, the offensive line felt like for sure that was going to work out for me. The corners, I think, are better than you think they are. But also, like, I'm not sure how good they are. I still think they need to be addressed. But again, the point is really not my opinion on the matter. It's about what the Colts are going to do as opposed to what we would do, right? So when describing the top of the draft, Chris Ballard predicted himself that you would see a lot of offensive players get drafted high in this draft. And he went on to further to piggyback off of that and say that he wasn't saying that to diminish the talent on defense, but instead to speak to the offensive talent that we see on the top end of the draft this year. Now, when making a prediction like that, if you're Chris Ballard, you have to assume he is internalizing that on some level in terms of his feelings on those weapons that are projected to go in the top end of the draft this year. So when you take all of that into account and you couple that with them bringing in Malik Neighbors for a visit, I think the first line of business for the Indianapolis Colts in this draft, the first thing on their brain is looking to see if they can trade up for whatever they deem is the right price. Now, it's not going to be for Marvin Harrison Jr. If you heard Ballard on Rich Eisen, you would have come out of it with the same exact opinion that I just gave you right there. But I think they're looking at the Falcons and the Bears as a spot where you may see Odunze or Neighbors or both available. If that is the case, you can count on the fact that Chris Ballard and the Indianapolis Colts will be at least making a phone call to see what it would take to move up to that spot because you just know for sure the New York Jets at number 10 are going to go offense. They just cannot help themselves. It's what they do. So between the Bears and the Falcons, and I do view the Bears as more likely, right? Because they have really next to no picks this year. I think 4 picks. They also just acquired DJ Moore last year, Keenan Allen this offseason. They may not feel the need to take a young wide receiver in this draft specifically. If we see a trade up for the Indianapolis Colts, point being, wrap it all up here, right? It's going to be one of those two teams, the Falcons or the Bears. Now, whether or not we see Odunze or Neighbors available at one of those picks really comes down, in my opinion, to what the Giants and the Chargers do, because both of those teams are in the market for a wide receiver right now, but the Giants can also go quarterback, and the Chargers can go offensive line, and about, I don't know, a 3 to 5% chance at most that you see the Chargers draft Brock Bowers with that pick, or perhaps they trade back themselves. So if you see the Giants and the Chargers not go wide receiver, either one or both of them not go receiver, the likelihood for the Colts trading up with the Falcons or the Bears really skyrockets quite a bit. Keep that in mind as we go into the draft. Now, either way, if we don't trade up, then I simply think it comes down to this: whether or not Brock Bowers is available at the number 15 pick for the Indianapolis Colts. I do not think the Colts will trade up for him. In fact, the Colts will not trade up for him, nor do I think they should. But I do think there would be a very, very high likelihood, if not a near guarantee, that if he's on the board at 15, the Colts would be drafting him. And while I'm not 100% sure I would personally make that pick if he was on the board at number 15, there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic about that pick if he were to be drafted at 15, despite some of what I said in my last episode. But regardless, we could save that discussion for, if and when the Colts end up with Brock Bowers. Now, if the Brock Bowers is not at that pick, I hope I'm not too hard to follow right now, but I'm trying to bring you through everything. We're talking about the Colts' first move. If he's not there, that's where we can go back and refer to the statement about the offensive versus the defensive talent in this draft, the prediction that Ballard made about offensive players being drafted early. What I personally took from that statement is that the Colts, and Chris Ballard specifically, view the players in the secondary right now, particularly at corner, that they would get at the number 15 overall pick as somewhat interchangeable, meaning they don't value the corners at 15 high enough above the guys that they would get in, I don't know, let's say the early to mid 20s of the first round. I think maybe they view all those corners and defensive, the guys in the secondary, kind of bunched together. So if there's no trade up for Neighbors or Odunze, and there is no Bowers at 15, I'm nearly certain that we see a trade back, or at least an attempt for the Colts to trade back. Like, you're going to see the clock ticking on that pick if there's no trade up, and if Bowers is not there. You're going to see the clock tick on the Colts. My guess is that if they were to trade back, it would be somewhere between the Bengals at 18 and the Eagles at 22. I view the Eagles to be the most likely candidate for that because of how much business we've done with them in the past, how, intertwined the Colts and the Eagles have been for quite a few years now, and how aggressive we've seen Howie Roseman be when making these types of moves. But realistically, it's hard to know exactly which team that's going to be. It's not my point. It's also hard to know if there's going to be a team looking to trade up to the 15th overall pick at all, although I view it as highly likely that there would be, which does bring me to the other possibility at 15 that is not Brock Bowers. I know I narrowed it down to just Bowers, but I'm retracting a little bit, and we'll wrap it all up, and I'll give you kind of a we'll cover it all again. Okay, we'll go back over it. I know I'm moving a little bit fast right now. Cooper DeJean at 15, very, very possible for the Indianapolis Colts. And that one, in my opinion, simply comes down to how they view him. Do they view him as a guy that can play safety? If they do, we know we need help at that position. Like, I like Nick Cross. I don't mind Rodney Thomas either. But you can't have all your eggs in that basket after the way things went this past season. Along with that, you have Julian Blackmon, who essentially just signed a prove-it deal, right? So if DeJean is a safety in the eyes of Chris Ballard and the Indianapolis Colts, at worst, he ends up replacing Blackmon moving forward. And at best, the Colts have a real promising young set of starters at that position in Blackmon and DeJean as a unit, right? So, are you following so far? The order of operations in terms of what the Colts will do in the first round. Let's round it up here so you know where we're at, okay? 1, trade up for Neighbors or Odunze at the price they deem reasonable with either the Falcons or the Bears. If that does not happen, they will draft Bowers at 15 if he's available. My guess is that the Jets draft him at 10. To which, at that point, we will see one of two things. Either the Colts drafting Cooper DeJean at 15, or the Colts trading back to a pick between 18 and 22 overall. All right? So that right there covers the first move. One of those scenarios will happen. Right there, all the waiting that you're doing, I just told you every possible scenario that you're going to see is not going to be anything different than what I just said. I promise. I promise. This is either going to age well or great. I'm 100% certain that everything I just told you is accurate. Okay? Now, on to our second move of the draft. So if we trade back, let's start there, right? There's really two things, one of them a little bit less interesting than the next. One, I predict that the Colts, if they trade back, will end up drafting the best player available from that slot. Whether that's 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, you get my point, right? The pool of players that would consist of, in my opinion, for the Indianapolis Colts, not for me, for the Indianapolis Colts. Again, that's the point. I'm not about me. I'm talking about the team. I believe their best player available in that range would be any one of these guys. Kool-Aid McKinstry, Nate Wiggins, Adonai Mitchell, Brian Thomas, Terrion Arnold, and if Cooper DeJean is available there as well, I would bet the house that they take him. But here is the part that I find significantly more interesting about the trade back, and one that I may be the only one that predicts for you. If the Colts traded back with any of those teams between the 18th and the 22nd overall pick, you can count on the fact that they would also end up with 2 second-round picks in this draft, because to trade up, presumably the package would be you give us 15 and I don't know, maybe like a conditional pick next year in some capacity, and we, being who is trading up, give you this first-round pick as well as our second-round pick, right? Now, everyone talks about the Colts restructuring D-Buck's deal as something that gave them money for after the draft. But I think the Colts may end up using one of those picks, if not both, to trade up back into the first round if a player they like is there. Ballard went out of his way in that press conference to talk about how in the past, when he felt the time was right, that they'd be willing to trade up for a guy if they felt like the right guy showed up. They did it for Jonathan Taylor. They did it for Josh Downs. And those are just right off the top of my head. I believe he even referenced one of those in there, right? So that money that they freed up for Buckner would actually allow them to take on a second first-round contract, right? Because obviously those are more expensive than second-round contracts, which are more expensive than third-round contracts. But generally speaking, most teams wouldn't have 2 first-round picks, and the Colts certainly didn't have the money to take on 2 first-round picks prior to the restructuring of the deal. Now I think they do, and I think there's a high likelihood that it happens. So the ones who those guys might be that they would trade up for in the first round, well, for starters, it's the ones I mentioned if they're available, right? So you have Kool-Aid McKinstry, Nate Wiggins, Adonai Mitchell, Brian Thomas, Cooper DeJean. But now in that mix, you can also add, you counting, you listening? Tyler Nubin, depending on whether or not we have Cooper DeJean, because he would be the other great safety prospect available. And that would kind of be it right there. Notice how I did not say Xavier Worthy in that mix. That is an unpopular opinion of mine, and I'm someone who liked his talent, was actually early on his talent. Not sure how many of you caught that. I did maybe talk about him once before everyone else was, but that's neither here nor there. He won't be a first-round pick this year. So that right there would cover everything in the first round. I hope that was easy enough to follow. I hope you're sticking with me. Now let's take a moment. Let's pause. How are we feeling? We got Coltradamus at work right now, baby. And get a little sip of water. Gotta love that H2O. There's nothing better than a good cup of water, right? I mean, what is better than a good cup of water? Is there anything else you want when you're thirsty other than water? You a Gatorade guy? Glass of milk? I mean, what are you looking for? Let's not digress too far. We're talking about the draft, right? Okay. Now let's talk about the second round. The Colts are either going to have 2 second-round picks or Obviously, they won't have 2 second-round picks, particularly if they draft Bowers or DeJean at 15. Those are the only 2 players, as I said, that you'll see them draft at 15 overall. You can take that to the bank. If they have 2 second-round picks, I can still see them trading up into the earlier part of the second round for any one of the following players: Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin, Ennis Rakestraw, who I think would be an awesome fit for us at corner, the kid out of Missouri, Tyler Nubin, if he's still available, Mike Santracil, or Kamari Lassiter out of Georgia, who I really like for the Indianapolis Colts. I actually think Ballard, by the way, he had dropped a nugget. If you remember, he referenced talking to someone at Georgia who had like a high football IQ, and maybe he just said the name Georgia in passing, but I personally think he was referring to Kamari Lassiter out of Georgia, if anyone at all. But here's a big disclaimer for you. Here's a big nugget. Here's a pipe bomb for you that is going to make you very, very upset. And maybe I will be the only one that predicts this. Do not be surprised if the Colts walk out of rounds 1 and 2 this year without drafting a corner, particularly if they do not trade back and only have 2 picks within those 2 rounds. If that is the case, we will be seeing the Colts adding 1 or 2 corners to come in and compete between rounds 3 and 6, along with potentially a safety and definitely some interior offensive line talent. Ballard said he loved the depth at the offensive line. I don't think he was bluffing. We will go over some of those names in the secondary in just a moment, but a quick roundup. I know I'm throwing a lot at you at once here, but by the end of round 2, any 2 or 3 of the following 15 players will be Colts. Ready for the names? Ready for the list? I'm about to give you all of it. You don't even have to know anyone else. These are the only guys you need to know. Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, Brock Bowers, Cooper DeJean, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Nate Wiggins, Adonai Mitchell, Brian Thomas, Terrion Arnold, Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin, Ennis Rakestraw, Tyler Nubin, Mike Santracil, Kamari Lassiter. Now, I know that isn't a concrete prediction, but that's also 15 of a possible 64 guys getting drafted inside the first 2 rounds. 2 or 3 of those guys out of the 15 that I gave you will be Indianapolis Colts going in to next week. You can take it to the bank, okay? Now, let's talk about some players in the mid-rounds to keep an eye on for Indy. Somewhat of a rapid fire, realistically. Again, one of these guys is going to be a Colt. I can guarantee it. I know I'm giving you a big list of players, but there's also a lot of players. So even if I'm saying a lot of names here, there's even more names that I'm not saying, right? So keep that in mind. Kalen Bullock, safety out of USC. He's a bit of a high-risk, high-reward type of prospect. He has a chance to be somewhat of like a solid center fielder type guy. You know, one of these ball hawk type guys at the safety position. He's a little bit inconsistent on tape, but there's potentially a solid football player there. That being said, a project player can see him on the Colts. Kyrie Jackson, corner out of Oregon. You just don't see too many guys that have his frame, his physical traits move the way he does, and we know how much the Colts like that type of player. He's a very solid tackler for the position. Can see him in Indy. Kalen Carson, corner out of Wake Forest. Solid off-coverage corner, physical both in coverage and as a tackler. I can see him being a fit. Chris Abrams-Drain, corner out of Missouri. Solid all-around corner. Missouri actually had a good pair of corners between him and Ennis Rakestraw, who I said earlier, who is, I believe, projected to go inside the top 40, 45 picks. Between both him or Abrams-Drain, who I just mentioned, there's a solid chance one of those guys is a Colt come next week. Now, Cam Hart, corner, Notre Dame. I think this guy has a chance to be a steal where he is going, but he also has the type of physical intangibles that the Colts look for at the position. He's really, really competitive, great frame for the position, and a guy projected to go in round 3 at the very earliest, if not later. Has a little bit of an injury history. Big question going into this past season for him was his shoulder. He managed to stay healthy throughout the entire year and then ended up skipping out on the Senior Bowl or whatever that is, right? Basically to avoid whatever risk there may be of injury headed into the draft. One thing I happen to like about him is that in 2022, they versed Ohio State. Kid got cooked. But then they came and versed them in 2023, albeit without CJ Stroud, without Jackson Smith and Jigba, but still with the kid number 2, what's his name? Emmanuel Abuka, right? And Marvin Harrison Jr. Cam Hart really played much, much better in the second time versus them than he did the first time. But yeah, that's that, right? So those guys right there are your kind of 3rd to 6th round secondary players. 1 or 2 of those guys will be an Indianapolis Colt come next week. So now you're talking about, I just gave you 4 of the Colts draft picks. You just heard those names. They were somewhere in that episode, okay? So now we are on the back end of the episode, and these are potential blockbuster moves that probably won't happen, but they just might. Number 1, and you'll hear me talk about this more as we probably go into the season, if it doesn't happen on draft day. The Colts trade Kwity Paye and draft a high-end pass rusher. Now, this obviously would throw a wrench in my entire prediction, but I do view it as a possibility, right? His 5th-year option needs to be picked up or passed up by May 2nd. If the Colts don't do that, he's officially a free agent after the upcoming season. Where do they stand on him? I don't know. I don't expect them to pick up that option if he's on the roster and not traded on draft day, which I don't, again, view as likely. That was kind of the title of the section, right? I view him not only as a trade candidate, though, on draft day, but also as we work into the season and the trade deadline. Curious to see how that one works out, but that is a weird move that I can still see happening. Don't count that one out. Number 2, the Colts draft a quarterback, either Spencer Rattler or Joe Milton. Back in the day, Washington Redskins, they were called at the time, right? Don't cancel me. That's what they called them. I know they're the Commanders now, and I know they were once the football team. By the way, Washington football team, one of the all-time great names in the history of sports. They should have kept that. Part of me wished that we were the Indianapolis football team. I mean, we're from Indianapolis. We play football. Does it get much better than that? I mean, that is as good as it gets. Neither here nor there. If you remember that year, they had drafted RG3 in round 1 and then Kirk Cousins in round 3 or 4. It ended up paying dividends for them, right? You take that into account. You also think about the fact that Joe Flacco is older than a Shane Steichen. And really, this regime with Steichen, when you talk about Chris Ballard and his job, this has to work, right? We're in that stretch. I've defended him more than anyone. We're in that phase where, okay, there are no more excuses. What we have in front of us, we need to see this team get going, right? And I view the possibility of them getting a quarterback as a little bit of insurance for Anthony Richardson in the case of an injury, which, my goodness, knock on wood, we don't want that to happen. Anthony Richardson is a special human in talent. But I would not be surprised if they end up with one of those 2 guys as an insurance option for Anthony Richardson. And number 3, and the most unlikely of these all, is that the Colts trade for either T. Higgins or Brandon Ayuk in this draft. It's unlikely because they would have to pay both of them a contract. That's why both of them are up on the trading block to begin with. The Colts don't plan to do that, I don't think. I can promise you that's not going to happen. But on the off chance it does happen, I don't want to make it like I wasn't aware of the very slight possibility that that would happen. And I'm going to give you a random number 4 off the top of my head. Last one, not really a blockbuster move, but a little bit of a wish list move, if you ask me, quite frankly, and would be a welcome surprise. The Colts draft Jermaine Burton, wide receiver out of Alabama, in round 2 or 3 or even 4 if he falls that far. Now, this is unlikely because of how much the Indianapolis Colts value character. We know that to be something. Obviously, every team values character, but I feel like the Colts even more so, right? I mean, think about how quick they were to suspend Isaiah McKenzie, Tony Brown, and then also let go of Isaiah Rodgers, despite the fact that he was considered to be one of their better prospects. Like, if you're not doing the model citizen thing to do with the Indianapolis Colts, you are out of there for the most part, right? That's what we've seen. And, his character, Jermaine Burton, that is, his history is questionable. But also, his tape cannot be denied. And in my opinion, there is not a single wide receiver in all of this draft that has a chance to return better, to give you a better return on investment as compared to where you drafted him than Jermaine Burton. That's just if you ask me. But that right there, that is it. That is the Colts draft preview. I just told you what's going to happen. Again, I didn't tell you specifically, but this episode did narrow it down enough. Something you heard in this episode is going to be what happens. I promise. I guarantee 100%. I just told you somewhere in here what the Colts are going to do. Some of you may think that was too vague. I think I narrowed it down plenty, all things considered. But, it is what it is. I think you're going to be shocked with how well this episode ends up aging. I cannot wait. But the next time you will see me will be post-draft. So enjoy it. Have a couple beers. Hang out with the friends. Order some food. And until next time, my name was Justin, or really is Justin. I didn't change my name. It's still Justin. My name is Justin. This right here is the Riding the Bench Colts podcast, and as always, go Colts.